Hey everyone. Um, Boy, long morning, long night. Um, this is this was not. I don't think anybody was planning on the end of the week being like this. The I wasn't planning on releasing a video today. I wasn't planning on doing a live stream today. But it's not. It's not a. It's not a. This is the effects of this New Glenn accident last night are pretty big, and there's sort of a figurative shockwave that's going through a lot of the space flight efforts that are associated with Artemis. Um, I put out a short video just to try and talk about a little bit of initial reactions. We really don't have a lot of hard facts at this point. There are some, I'm seeing some reports while I was right after I finished putting the video together, before and after, and a little bit overnight. But it's going to be a while, I think, before we have, a clear understanding. But there are probably some things that are more obvious than others. It's going to be a long time to recover the New Glenn Launch Complex. Pardon me. And that may be the longest or the most the critical path for getting sort of returning to launch operations for the vehicle. There are a lot of questions about what happens with recently awarded contracts, awarded as recently as Tuesday. So there's just a lot of questions. And before the accident, there were a lot of questions about what was going to be happening with Artemis 3 and Artemis 4 and Artemis 5. This doesn't, I guess, unfortunately resolves a few of them, but it doesn't really seem to make things any more certain. If anything, it just changes the uncertainty, but I don't know that it decreases it. So anyway, this is, it's, I think in a way, I think there's still sort of a little sense of shock, and we're still getting over the shock of seeing that last night. I was not watching it live, but, and I mean, that's the thing. I don't know that there was, this was an important launch, but I don't know that anybody was thinking, about this, that wasn't, I in the video, I note that the NSF, NASA spaceflight folks, of course, they have their Space Coast live stream, and they were intently focused on the test and were covering it live. And I'm sure other places like Spaceflight Now that have facilities and broadcast capabilities there were also doing that. But I don't know that I would call it a routine test, but it also wasn't, I don't know that, for instance, we were watching it as, I certainly wasn't watching it as closely as the first vehicle, Static Fire, or the second one. So this was obviously just a huge, unfortunate surprise. And so it sort of turns over all the plans, all the near-term plans for a lot of people. So I don't know. Again, I don't know that there's a lot of answers at this point, but it is going to have an impact. I think one thing I'll note, I think there's some question, given the relationship that Blue Origin had to Artemis 3. We just heard Tuesday evening, NASA had basically announced the Artemis 3 flight crew announcement. So an announcement of the announcement that was put on the calendar for June 9th. And for what it's worth, I got an email from Johnson Space Center Public Affairs a couple of hours ago while I was working on the video, asking me to fill out a request form for interviewing for a possible interview of Artemis 3 crew members. I'm not expecting, given the small size of my channel audience, to get that. But I think I would take that as an indication that they're at least still planning to go ahead with naming the crew. I imagine the crew has already been selected, since we're less than 2 weeks away from when the selections were planned to be made public. So I would expect that. I guess I'm still expecting that to go ahead. That'll be in Houston on Tuesday, June 9th. But in terms of the rest of it and how that impacts when Artemis 3 flies and some of these other things, we're what? I mean, we're more than 12 hours since the accident, but not much more than that, and it's going to take a while to figure out what happens next. Let's see. So yeah, Nick, I mean, that's one of the areas for sure. I think we're looking because of how important Blue Origin is to not just Artemis but the industry itself, and it was trying to mature the system and enhance it, and because of how important that is, it has implications not just for Artemis directly, but also, as Nick Alexander's saying, we are going to certainly be watching to see how policymakers, as he says, respond. But I think I saw a statement released by Representative Brian Babin, I believe, who's the chairman of the House Appropriations. I believe it's the subcommittee that oversees that has the responsibility of the Commerce, Justice, and Science and related agencies, which is basically that they're the ones that draft the NASA part of the budget. So what I think we're going to be looking for, in addition to statements like that, is how is that reflected in future legislation? So now the House has already marked up the NASA appropriations for fiscal year 2027, but we have not seen the Senate bill yet. They have not, I don't know if they've had a hearing yet. Maybe they have, but they have not released a draft bill or the accompanying report, which is where we saw a lot of the directives from in the House bill. So we'll see if there is any response, so to speak, in that legislation. But I think that's really the key in terms of a real response or an actionable response is going to have to come through that. That's really going to have the weight. The words of the bills and the reports carry some legal weight, and that's what we're going to be looking for, I think, ultimately. In terms of a response from Washington, there's a whole bunch of other things that have to happen in terms of NASA and the programs and NASA management and NASA leadership. That's a different question. And so, but I do think that's, the response from Washington is one of those things that we're going to be looking at. I'm not. I guess Deuce is asking, can Blue Moon go up with Artemis 3? Oh, okay. I think if I'm understanding your question correctly, you're asking if Blue Moon could go up with Artemis 3 in the empty stage adapter of SLS, and if that's the case, no. the current SLS vehicle, the there's the cone-shaped adapter. Let me see, let me go ahead and actually that's probably a good graphic to put up here just to clarify. Just because it's a it's a simplified cutaway drawing, but it serves the purpose here if I can find it. And then I'll zoom in a little bit, but you can see. So here's the space between Orion up here and the core stage, which is, basically from here down. This is the very top of the core stage. And so you can see that what's inside the adapter is the working moving parts of the interim cryogenic propulsion stage, the upper stage. So yes, that you could remove that, but then you have no way of propelling that cargo into a stable orbit. So on Artemis 3, the core stage and the boosters will cut off it's in a type of orbit that's similar to what we just saw Starship do a week ago, where you might have an apoapsis or an apogee that's high enough to be safe and stay in orbit, but the perigee is below what they would call a safe perigee. So when all of that hardware gets down to the perigee, it's going to re-enter, and then you have to deal with re-entering. So without the upper stage, it's a sort of a chicken and egg thing. So the upper stage would be used to put Orion plus the payload into a stable orbit. Since you're not flying that on Artemis 3, you have room to stick something in there, but you don't have an upper stage to actually keep it in a safe orbit. So there's volume, but there's no propulsion to deal with that extra mass. So you would need something like the Block 1B configuration of SLS in order to carry a large payload besides Orion. And as we've seen, exploration upper stage is now terminated, so that's not going to happen. So there are really, I did see a little bit of postings from some other folks in the media talking about possible options for launching Mark 1 Blue Moon Mark 1, or whatever this interim hybrid version of the landers was. And I think it seems like what we're hearing is that there's enough of a coupling between the Blue Moon landers and New Glenn. They're maybe not tightly coupled, but strongly coupled enough, I guess, that it would be hard for another vehicle, another launch vehicle, to be sort of payload agnostic. You'd have to develop essentially a custom adapter for Blue Moon to fly on another launch vehicle. So yeah, that's, I think, an obvious question, which I'm sure that United Launch Alliance is keenly interested in, is whether the root cause of this it points towards the first stage engines, which they share with, at least have some commonality with, New Glenn, the Blue Origin's BE4 engine, or whether it's or it could be something that has to do with the integration of the stage in the engine, but again, they will be looking to see what needs to, if they need to do anything with the engines that they have. I imagine there will be a lot of people looking at what happened last night and at least reconsidering whether they need to change their approach at all, or whether they need to actually make some physical changes to hardware, or a little bit of both. So, but that's definitely a one of the questions here. Other than just the generic, what's the root cause of what happened last night? And so, yeah, as Anthony's saying, I'm falling behind in chat as usual, but yeah, this is going to be one of the immediate questions is obviously the impact on Artemis 3, but to be fair, same thing with Artemis 4. So as much as this might put Blue Moon and Blue Origin out of Artemis 3, it also puts them up behind at least their schedule for competing to fly the Artemis 4 lunar landing. Since we don't know either Blue Moon schedule to any degree or the Starship schedule on the SpaceX side, it's hard to say, and as I mentioned in the video, I'd say the primary comparison is for the schedules is to the calendar itself, because the goals, the goals in terms of time are versus the calendar. So again, by the end of 2028, they want a lunar landing by the end of this administration. And so it's more about, to some extent, it's more about how that relates to those. But it also, if you did want to look and see who's quote unquote ahead, if that's even possible, even if that was possible to judge, which it may not have been 24 hours ago, there is a question now. They're obviously going to lose a significant amount of time, at least months, if not longer. And so you wonder whether or not this basically impacts Artemis 4 as well, because we're really only about a year and a half away from the target date for Artemis 4, which was early 2028. And a significant part of that time is going to be Blue Origin's going to be working to recover from this accident. So, it could be Artemis 3 and Artemis 4, and again, also possibly Artemis 5. And so, yeah, I saw that, I saw that note, which I think is, it's always kind of interesting what new information we get and why. And so that this idea that the Blue Moon, I assume Mark 1, if not Mark 2, both landers have their propellant supplies topped off by the second stage of New Glenn. I believe that's the first that's the first I've ever heard of that. And it's not odd that it comes out because of this, but I don't know about unfortunate, but I don't, the rhetorical question is, what was preventing us from learning about that before the accident? Is it just that there was no question that it was going to fly on New Glenn? To me, that's an interesting detail, and also helps understand. It helps in terms of understanding how they fuel that spacecraft, and maybe differentiating how they fuel Blue Moon versus the second stage on the pad. So that's an interesting bit of detail, but also interesting that it comes out because of the accident. So, I mean, Brian's asking about should I, should I continue to apply, assume for a job with Blue Origin? I mean, it depends on, obviously, just in general, depends on what you want to do. So, I don't really, the major loss here for Blue Origin, there could be more. It could be, it will perhaps get more concrete here, but I mean, the biggest loss here is just time. So, um, it may impact, well, that's not, it will impact the short term, for the company. But, we saw Jeff Bezos very quickly reaffirm support and said, we will rebuild. They will get back on their feet. If you find, if what they were doing was attractive or interesting to you before, it this might shake your confidence to some extent, but I think it's really more about, it's going to delay the, time to market for the systems, I think, more than, cancel them. This is not the same thing as, the government programs, for instance, where you can pull the plug on them for other reasons. So, I mean, you could certainly see an accident like this, if it was as far reaching, having an impact on the government program, certainly. And we have seen that in the past, but, it's really, I think, more about where you see yourself, in 5 years. Because I think, I don't know that this necessarily I would still expect to see, the Blue Moon architecture come to fruition, and certainly see New Glenn, return to flight. I know we've seen some rumors today that maybe they will move to the upgraded, version of the launch vehicle with the 9x4, variant. But yeah, I think it comes down to, what do you want to, what are you interested in, and what's your time frame as well? Because, I mean, maybe that's one of the things that this is maybe sort of more subtly underscores, is how long it takes to get these systems mature and to get them into a steady tempo. Everybody's trying to get to where Falcon 9 is, but even that took a significant amount of time to get to that steady tempo, and so, I don't know that they obviously had a very, well-known, incident like this, but I don't know that it was the circumstances for that were different. As an example being, they had already, I think they were just about to activate another launch pad at the time of that famous 2016 accident. Was it 20? I think it was 2016 accident. So they're in a different situations, different circumstances. But the point being, it did not, Falcon 9 continued, and they recovered from that. Again, positions themselves maybe a little bit, had more flexibility in that case, but, I do think that Bezos and is still committed to Blue Origin and these systems. And so it's just a question of, you're going to have to spend, these are long-term careers that span lots of time. You end up spending a lot of time on these systems. And so if you enjoy doing that, then it's just a question of, do you want to look at this company or somebody else, and what you want to do. Yeah, I've seen, there's there are different contingents. There are obviously different routing sections for different teams, so to speak. And so there's that type of reaction. I know there are still some support out there for the systems that were canceled here essentially three months ago, the SLS upgrades that were canceled. But again, because the major loss here is time, the one of the reasons I think stated, maybe left unstated, but I probably stated somewhere behind closed doors, is just, I mean, I think the biggest problem with SLS Block 1B and EUS is just that they had been around for a long time, and it had never reached its first flight. So, we saw several, just like as I said in the video with Artemis 3, we've seen several dates, and we've seen the target date for the first lunar landing move from end of 2024 to now the beginning of 2028. But I mean, that's a significant amount of time there too. So those systems don't have the financial commitments behind them that some of these other ones do. So because it was so late, it was left open to this possibility of being canceled. So, and I think the question for that system, it's kind of a moot point at this point because I believe it's terminated. But it wasn't likely to be ready by the end of 2028 to fly. And so, as I also say in the video, the impacts are directly on Blue Origin. This doesn't, maybe relative to what we saw last night, exploration upper stage as a concept looks different right at that moment in time, but it doesn't really change the concept or when it would be ready. And so it doesn't really change any of these other independent systems. So yeah, I don't think for that and other reasons, it's just not, it's not viable. And to be fair, you can see events like this causing people to change their minds and go in different directions. But it would be odd for something like that to come back because of something that happened to another, basically an independent event. So. Let's see. Sorry, I how far behind? I'm still behind here. Let's see. Let me. Okay. So again, I'm a little behind. Joe was asking, does Congress really care if a crewed lunar landing happens in 2029 and not 2028? Because it's politics, I do think a number of them do care. I guess you could make the argument that there are some that probably are more care more about it happening before China than before 2029. But I do think there are a lot of people that do care that it happened. Not just politicians, but others that it does happen by the end of 2028. And so, yeah, I guess one of the things about the crew announcement on June 9th that's interesting maybe unfortunately, but I was asking because the announcement said, let me see if I can pull that up. Well, I mean, the announcement, the media advisor that went out said that they're going to provide a mission update and announce the crew, which I thought was kind of interesting, odd in an odd way, because when they did this for Artemis 2, there was no mission update. That ceremony, that event was about the crew and about naming the crew, and whether it was stated or not, it was about that it was supposed to be all about the crew. And so I thought it was odd that they were going to do that, but okay, so since they put that in the advisory, I started asking public affairs, well, what will as media, would we be allowed to ask questions based on whatever they say, follow up with questions on whatever they say, because it's unlikely that they're going to answer all of the questions, because there are a lot of questions about what's going to happen on Artemis 3 24 hours that existed 24 hours ago. But now, and so the response that I got back, the vibe I got back was that it would be similar to Artemis 2, that really June 9th is about the crew. It's about giving the crew their day, and that there wasn't going to be much. So it was like, well, okay. But I think now, unless maybe NASA leadership will decide to have some sort of a media briefing before June 9th. But if they don't, then it's going to be harder to avoid if we get to that date without anything from NASA about what they're going to do. Now, to be fair, because this is such an it's an unfortunate event, but it is a big event. I guess my expectation would be we will hear something substantive from NASA about how they're going to deal with this, and maybe some initial thoughts about what they're going to do. Possibly even before June 9th. But if not, this is just going to make it a bigger. I don't think it overshadows the crew announcement, but it's hard not to put that. It would be another one of the elephants in the room that come along, and all that end up going into all the rooms that we go into these days. Yeah, I think it's probably too early to. I mean, it's not too early to speculate, because we're going to do that regardless. But it's a tough question that asking when they return to flight. What will they launch first? I mean, they could choose to just do a demonstration flight, and kind of like the first flight. The first flight launched. I believe it launched essentially just a test package. So, we could see something like that again if they don't want to risk a paying customer. So yeah, and that's the thing, is all of the questions that existed 24 hours ago. There's a lot of uncertainty, because we really weren't getting there's just not a lot of evidence about progress for the well, that's not a good way. I guess probably the more charitable way of putting it is because we are seeing progress, and you could say the same thing about the Chinese lunar lander program, Blue Origin, and SpaceX. Maybe up until last night, we were seeing progress from all three of them, but the same situation essentially exists for all three of them because they're all secret programs. It's really difficult to tell how much more work they have. So it's like they're taking steps forward, but there's a big difference between if you have 10 steps more to do versus 100, or even just 10 steps versus 20 or 25 or 30. So we really don't know. We don't know where they are. You can't put their progress on a calendar. And if you can't do that, it probably isn't as important to the businesses, but obviously SpaceX has got their IPO is going to be in the next handful of weeks, possibly. That may not be as important, certainly not the Artemis part of it, to the business. But for NASA and for the government, they chose to define this in terms of a deadline. You can either or a race. So one of them is maybe a little bit more not open-ended, but has a little bit more of a vague back end to it, since you can win that race by just getting there before China gets there. But the other one, in this case, the White House set a firm deadline of, you can either call it December 31st, 2028, or you could call it January 19th or 20th, 2029. So it's important to put things in context on a calendar given those circumstances, and they're not. I mean, I think that's going to be the question. So Brian's asking, what will NASA leadership, what will Jared Isaacman, NASA administrator, say? I think he issued a statement last night on social media. I would expect we will hear more from him, either on social media or more formally, so to speak. But I mean, what he said on social media tends to be, is something that we can is official enough, I guess. It's certainly maybe definitive. It is what he does speak his mind, and he has provided information on social media. And so I certainly would expect to hear more from him in the next several days. But it also may take a while to understand. There are some things probably that NASA understands already just based on the severity of this event, but there may be, it may not answer critical questions that they need to have answered. So, yeah, it's not. I think we've already heard from him. Again, my expectation is we'll hear more from him in the next handful of days. But I mean, yeah, and from my standpoint, what I would be more interested in is to get a sense of a more detailed sense or a more concrete sense of the impact of this. Maybe not today, but just where this puts them. If, for example, what might seem obvious, if this is going to push New Glenn, Blue Origin into next year significantly, for instance, then the obvious thing to do would be to fly Artemis 3 with just Starship. But that doesn't. We had a whole bunch of Starship questions, and we had a whole bunch of Starship schedule questions, and this didn't affect those at all. It didn't answer any of them either. So it's hard, so you still have those schedule questions. We had Artemis 3 schedule questions about Orion, about all the programs, Orion, SLS, Axiom, Blue Origin and SpaceX. And so, I mean, this is a horrible way to get some clarity on the Blue Origin situation. But it doesn't, I don't know that it speaks to any of the other program situations. I mean, I said that in the video. This doesn't delay Orion or SLS, and it doesn't help them either. So, let's see. So, Nitro's asking how much of the severity of this accident. Well, that's okay. That's a little bit more of a subtle. How much of the severity of this accident do you think is down to the use of liquid methane as a fuel? I think it's fair to say that it well, NASA and the Space Force were trying to get data. They were doing experiments on I guess maybe the best way to put it is the blast danger of using this type of fuel, which is similar to what's used on Starship as well. I think the collateral I mean, the thing is that there has to be some sense of, insurance, I guess, in a very, very general sense. So one of the thoughts I had last night is I was thinking about how far the vehicle assembly building is away from the pads at Launch Complex 39. And we talked about this during the early part of the year. It's like it takes a long time to roll SLS and the mobile launcher and Orion out from the VAB to the pad. And it's, if you look at other pads, so pad 41, they have the VIF, the vertical integration facility is relatively close. Now I'm not going to get into there's the complex, they're now activating another VIF farther away, but still the point is that the VAB's a long ways away. It takes, it essentially takes a day's worth of work to get the vehicle from one point to another, as opposed to a few hours. And so, having seen what happened last night, I think I have not more of an appreciation, but I was reminded of why they chose to do that back in the 60s. And so there was a famous accident. It might actually have been, I don't know if it was on at the same location at Launch Complex 36, but the Atlas Centaur 5 vehicle exploded on the pad. I think at that point NASA had already cited where the VAB and pads A and B were going to be at Launch Complex 39, but I think they used some of that data for figuring out their blast danger areas. I believe that was in I want to say 1966. But the it is something that it's something, one of those things that I was thinking about last night is, they should have a decent understanding about this fuel, using this as the rocket fuel. And it then comes down to risk. And so how much insurance you have for that risk. So, one of the things you have, just like at other pads, they have a horizontal integration facility at Launch Complex 36 that's, relatively close to the pad. And seeing the accident last night, I think there's a lot of questions about whether that's how they balance the risk there in terms of how close that is to the pad, given the use of these given the use of liquid methane. Is that too close, or is it, or was that based on their risk analysis? And maybe they would consider, maybe they'll consider either a different concept of operations and maybe de-risking hardware in there. I mean, again, we will see, but I think there's a lot of fear that the other hardware that was being either stored or prepared in the HIF at 36 was damaged. I've seen some pictures of, I think I saw a picture of the doors that were facing away from the pad, and they look like they look warped by the blast wave. And so, those, that means that all of the equipment inside saw that before the back doors did. So I think it's more, I think you just have to have, once you make that choice, then you have to base some other things in terms of your ground operations and your risks, in terms of that. I mean, again, one of the other things that I've seen in some stories today talk about, this was not a launch, this was a static fire. And so, I mean, it again, we don't know the details at this point, but it just seems based on the severity of the explosion and the damage and the collateral damage, that the impact to the launch pad and the launch complex may be more critical than the loss of a particular tail number, so to speak. It's like Blue Origin is positioned to build more rockets. That's not the way to say it. Blue Origin can build another rocket, another first stage and second stage, and another seven first stage engines and another 2 second stage engines. I would say probably much faster than they can build another launch pad. And they're basically going to have to do that now. Now we'll see how bad it is and whether they, what fraction of a whole new launch pad they have to build. But again, it seems like, just based on what we've heard, that it's going to be a large fraction of a whole new launch pad. So, Mr. Pashto 96 is asking, could NASA reassign the rover missions? I think, sadly, it's a good question. I don't know. I would think that they would have to at least look into it under the circumstances. Also, given how quickly they want to move into moon base missions. The Mark 1 lander was they already had based several missions on that. And so, yeah, it's going to be, we will see. Again, it is very early in this in terms of big picture and strategic decisions and changes in those types of things. But I think they at least have to look at alternatives. Maybe, for instance, they move those contracts to other moon base missions. So Blue would still have those awards. It's just they would, as you're implying, they could maybe they could, these first 2 rovers, those awards would go maybe individually to other launch providers. But, again, having said that, the New Glenn vehicle has, there aren't a lot of launch vehicles that have that type of performance. And so, there's the question of what other systems could deliver those rovers, to the moon. especially in the times of the type of time frames that we're looking at. Yeah, I mean, so the next comment about, or the next one I'm picking here, talking about it, Mr. Pash was saying, I don't think the issue is the commercial sector. It's that the landers weren't procured until SLS was basically ready to fly. The lander contracts should have been handed out way earlier. I think that's a fair assessment, especially given how the lunar landing has risen in prominence as in terms of a priority. But I think the other thing is that they're because SLS has a low flight rate and has sort of become a niche rocket, and because that's where the government was putting a lot of its investment money, they really have come to rely on Elon Musk, SpaceX, and Jeff Bezos and Blue Origin, because they both of them are investing or drawing on private funding that the government does not have to provide to fund key technologies here. So, Blue Moon or New Glenn was flying at a faster rate than SLS will fly at. Obviously, Starship is still in prototype form, but the promise is that they will be flying on a rapid cadence eventually. And so I had been talking about how the government seems to be transitioning away from their own systems, but it also seems like they're transitioning away from their own money in terms of investments here. And so that works as long as there's a private investment community that's willing to spend money. And in those terms, we're sort of in a golden age of that, another golden age of that right now. So we're seeing just a lot of private investment money. So this is a sort of a seller's market, I guess, so to speak, if you have space technology to sell. And so that works for the government because then they don't have to pay for it. But there were periods of time, and certainly earlier than maybe at the beginning of this decade, where it wasn't quite so obvious. And so a lot of that private money, investment money, wasn't necessarily going to space technology, but it is now. So yeah, things are changing. And so I think that's part of the reason why we didn't see as much money put into it, because I think what we're seeing is, even though there's some disagreements here and some, cuts in this or that, philosophical, like there's there's a lot of science cuts or a lot of, cuts of the government programs. But generally speaking, the government has funded NASA at the same approximate level. The growth of government spending for NASA is either flat or maybe even slightly negative over the last several decades. So they're spending about the same amount of money on NASA. And so, it's just that's kind of the way it is. So, what it means is when they're bringing up systems like Orion and SLS that require more money or more time or both, then you have less money to do other things. And so right now, there's outside money that they can leverage. So, it's like that would be, I don't think we'll necessarily hear how much money, we were just those moon-based contracts, how much money, how much of the overall cost of those missions is the government spending and how much of it is coming from other investment. And so that's the reason. And so, yes, and that's the same reason that NASA didn't build their own moon lander. And so, Victor's asking, why didn't NASA build their own lunar lander? And it's because it's too expensive for their blood, so to speak. So, so for the last 15 years or so, well, so back up just a little bit. After the Columbia disaster accident in 2003, the shuttle program was retired. It was basically put in transition and retirement, basically by the end of that decade, and that more or less happened. And then they started the Constellation program. A couple of years later, they transitioned to making Constellation the next goal for human space flight. But then that was canceled at the beginning of 2010. Then there was a compromise. So that the thing is, when Constellation was canceled, they weren't transitioning from Constellation to anything else. They were just ending it. And so the Congress was not happy with that, and they compromised with what we now know to be Orion and SLS. So, but that happened in part, but not completely. But that happened during the financial crisis. A lot of that happened during the financial crisis that began towards the end of 2008. So there was even less money for NASA during the early part of the 2010s, which was when NASA was trying to finish to get the Orion design through critical design review and into production, and basically to start the SLS core stage, which is the most complicated part of the stage. Start that from scratch, so it's basically the core stage takes the shuttle engines, but basically with few exceptions, that's really the only heritage equipment in the core stage. The rest of it is all new designs, new builds. And so that took them a long time, and they didn't have a lot of money on top of that. So there was no money. And when they canceled Constellation actually consisted conceptually of a crew launch vehicle, a crew transportation vehicle. So the crew launch vehicle was Ares 1, crew transportation vehicle was Orion, a cargo launcher, which would have been Ares 5, and a lunar lander. Of course, they'd never paid for Ares 5 or the lunar lander, and those were basically, I don't think those ever sniffed preliminary design review. And so there just wasn't enough money to do that. And in fact, when Constellation was canceled, Orion was supposed to be the crew rotation vehicle for the International Space Station. So even though they were talking up the lunar angle for Constellation, that was still way in the future. And one of the reasons that they canceled the Constellation is because they weren't even going to get to the lunar stuff till the end of the 2010s. So again, they weren't. There just hasn't been the appetite to fund. And to be fair, the reason that they haven't been willing to fund a lot of these, it's again one of the many chicken and egg things here, where Congress is willing to spend money on it, but they've capped their spending because they've seen what happens with the money. They tend to spend money over a long period of time, and they get less results than are advertised at the beginning. But they're not willing to really break the cycle. It's this, in a way, you can argue what they're doing now with the transition to commercial it will eventually break the cycle, but we will see. But that's one of the reasons why is they were not willing to spend the money to stand up a lunar, a crude lunar transportation system, lunar capable rocket to launch that, and a lunar lander. They were willing to do the first two, but not the third. And so when the lunar lander came up again in President Trump's first term, they were only willing to pay a little bit of it, probably somewhere between 25 and 50%. And so, as I said earlier, they were very happy to see people like Mr. Musk and Mr. Bezos show up who are willing to spend way more money than they were on these systems because of their own business cases. So that's it. And so one of the things one of the possible conclusions, not necessarily the only one that you could draw from that, is that there's interest in a lunar lander and lunar landings, but only so much. So it's like eventually, it's like the government has only been willing to put some money where their mouth is on this. And so now they don't have to, because there's commercial interest in possible business. This would be the best of both worlds for them eventually, probably in the next decade at the soonest, but they won't have to put any money where their mouth is. So yeah, this question's come up. Thomas is asking, can Falcon Heavy launch the Blue Origin's lander from a lift? Well, the Mark 1 cargo lander was designed to be launched to the moon by New Glenn in a single launch with no refueling. The full crude lunar landing architecture, the Mark II architecture, was, let me pull it up. Let's see. Where can I? Yes. So this is probably still is the Blue Origin's Mark II architecture, and you can see there's a lot of these dark blue are all of the refueling launches that have to take place. So, and at least conceptually very similar to Starship. The details are different, of course, but you have Falcon Heavy probably could launch, again, from a lift capacity standpoint, could launch some of this, but it wouldn't necessarily be able to, again, when you get down to the details of integrating this spacecraft with that rocket, companies like, maybe a good example actually would be the Amazon LEO satellites that we're going to launch on that rocket that no longer exists. But right now I'm looking over at NSF Space Coast Live. There's an Atlas V at Pad 41 right now that's going to launch, or is scheduled to launch, a smaller set of those satellites in a few hours. So those satellites were designed to be launched again, to be fair, so the way that they did this, but the general idea is they're designed to be launched on multiple launchers. The way that they're doing that is they have different dispensers that fit on different launch vehicles. For some of these things, like Blue Moon Mark 1 and probably also Blue Moon Mark 2, they aren't necessarily designed to be launch vehicle agnostic or or have support equipment to make them launch vehicle agnostic. So Amazon Leo satellites are more launch vehicle agnostic. Blue Moon Mark 1 and Mark 2, not so much. And so that's what, even though a Falcon Heavy might be able to lift a doorstop that has the same mass as a fully fueled Blue Moon Mark 1 lander, the lander has other integration needs. And so this was something that was mentioned in chat earlier, where we apparently, what we're hearing today for the first time, at least in public, is that the Mark 1 cargo lander is getting some level of liquid oxygen, liquid hydrogen replenishment from the New Glenn second stage. And so that's a special add-on to the New Glenn second stage that other launch vehicles wouldn't necessarily have. So I'm sure if SpaceX could make something that worked, if Blue Origin paid them enough money, they could probably do it. Or somebody was willing to pay them to do it, but I don't know that they're certainly not going to do it out of the goodness of their heart. So that's kind of that's sort of an overview of why the mass of it could be yeeted by Falcon Heavy probably, but you wouldn't actually be able to fully integrate without spending money and spending time. So those modifications, the custom connectors between another launch vehicle and Blue Moon, they would take time to design and have the companies, the launch provider and the spacecraft designers and operators work together to make that work. So, it's not impossible, but it might be expensive and take too long. That's part of the problem. That's a good way of putting it. Black Star. That is a good way of putting it. So, Congress wants the result without having to spend the money on it. Congress wants the result without the funding. And yes, and so just like lots of us, if you find a situation where you can have it both ways, that's great. It's just that there aren't. Typically, you need more money and more wealth to have to generate more situations like that where you can have it both ways. Typically, you don't, especially the less money and wealth you have. So, yeah. So yes, Congress wants to have it both ways, and wouldn't we all? Yeah, and that's a fair point. So that's a fair point about there was an option, although it wasn't presented as such at the time that Constellation was canceled. So again, the Obama administration, which was in power at the time, they just said they just canceled Constellation, and I think they proposed some technology, technology R&D spending, but I don't believe they proposed a lander that would be launched by commercial launch vehicles. But Congress could have done that, or Washington collectively, between the legislative branch and the executive branch, if there was a consensus to do that at the time, they could have gone down that road. But it's sort of what's the consensus on what folks want to do. So the the Obama administration didn't want any part of Orion or SLS, but they wanted commercial crew and cargo, and particularly commercial crew. So they compromised. So that's, and that's often what happens. So Congress wanted Orion and SLS. They didn't really, I don't know that they were as enthusiastic about commercial crew as the White House was, that White House. So they compromised. So that is, and certainly back at the time there would have been more skepticism. I think if you were able to take people in a time machine to where we are now and then take them back to 2010, you might have been able to convince more people to go with, to let the commercial launch industry that was there at the time, define what you need to send cargo payloads to the moon, and then let the launch industry, bid on those. But that's, it takes a long time for a lot of these things to get sort of an evolved consensus on some of these things. And again, to be fair, I don't know that they're all the way there yet. There's a sort of a stronger sense of making this transition to commercial transportation, full commercial lunar transportation service, but we're not there yet. And I think people will argue that you still have these issues with that. You can have issues like this. And so there are still people who want to maintain a national capability, but this is this whole trying to have it both ways. They want to maintain the national capabilities that they have for the space, for the spacecraft and the rocket, and they want the lunar landing, but they don't want to pay for it. So yeah, but yeah, there certainly were and are, at several different times. So again, the first Trump administration, I think, was essentially proposing what Andrean Ocean is saying. So this is essentially back in 2019. I'm trying to remember if it was 2019 or 2020. I think it was beginning in 2019. So what they proposed at that time was to basically end the SLS upgrades, which the exploration upper stage was already in existence as conceptually at that point. End it and use the money and start to shift funding from SLS to the lunar landers. And again, they could not come to a consensus with that Congress or those Congresses. I think it was one Congress, but they still were not able to convince that Congress to do that. And so that Congress basically kept doing things the way that they'd been doing it before. So yeah, Joe's asking, did Blue have plans to build a second launch pad? I think they had they'd started the groundwork to build a second launch pad at Launch Complex 36. But I was not really paying attention to that as much up until last night. And so considering what happened last night, I would wonder how close that was to the current facilities, since the current facilities at least seem to have taken a significant amount of collateral damage from the explosion. So if how do you protect, how do you mitigate the risk of something like this happening again, and mitigate the risk to having a huge, a significant amount of downtime? and SpaceX had already, we were talking about the SpaceX accident back in 2016 with the Amos 6. I mean, it really wasn't with the payload just happened to be there. So the payload wasn't there last night, but this is still going to have, I mean, I know people are talking about those 48 satellites that were, that are in the New Glenn dispenser, the 48 Amazon Leo satellites. And so, but I mean, I wonder about the cost, how much those satellites, I guess, I mean, it as funky as it sounds, I think Blue Origin today would rather have lost those satellites and kept the pad. I don't know how you do that exactly with a rocket failure, but it's they will the losing the pad. Maybe we will hear something different, but losing the pad is the big blow, at least as it stands right now. And I think that's why they wanted to have, I think that's part of the reason why they wanted to have a second pad. And I believe I thought we'd heard that they were building another pad out at Vandenberg, but for a different reason. I don't know that they would necessarily be using the Vandenberg pad for, tanker flights, for Blue Moon Mark II tanker flights. Although in theory, I guess you could do it. So I'm not sure, again, for New Glenn, they had started work on a significant upgrade to the current design, where the current design was a first stage with 7 engines and a second stage with 2, going to a first stage with 9 engines and a second stage with 4. So a large performance increase. But, again, I don't know how much resources, what their plan was in terms of kind of what we're seeing with SpaceX at Starbase right now with the two pads. They just launched the first version 3 on the second pad, and now they're converting the first pad over to support the vehicles, but that pad's offline right now. So, that's I think even with 2 pads, if they don't both support the same, if they don't support the same configuration of the vehicle, can you use both vehicles, both vehicle configurations? I mean, sort of similar to Falcon, where you have the pad, you have Launch Pad 39A that can launch. It can launch both single stick Falcon 9s and the triple core Falcon Heavy. And so that's that they can do that from that one launch mount, whereas I don't know, it's those are they're interesting questions though. But also I don't know that certainly for Artemis and for the first the rumored concept that we're talking about, they were still going to need 3 or 4 New Glenn launches in relatively rapid succession. So I don't know. Again, you just have to see whether what they were talking about in terms of how they would pull that off, and in how and what time frame. Again, we really had zero. Well, not zero details, but they were all leaked details, and there was certainly, you could go several levels. You could go down that rabbit hole, and you almost have to. It seems like a mixed metaphor to go down a rabbit hole to just get a basic understanding of something. But we needed more details than have been leaked in order to understand what they were trying to do. So. Yeah. So yeah, I mean that's the thing though, is like, again, now we're getting into, which is fine, but so Joe's talking about going back to 1970 and not canceling the Apollo program, but they didn't cancel the Apollo program because it wasn't working. They canceled it because it was more expensive. The price tag was too high for what for what they were getting out of it. It's sort of, again, cost benefit. So once they beat the Soviets with Apollo 11, even Congress, and even Congress, you couldn't convince that Congress back then that the benefit of just continuing that indefinitely, either continuing the pre-Apollo 11 plans, which were much more extravagant, with the post-Apollo 11 plans, where they were going to go from this surge to win the race with the end of the decade and to beat the Soviets. They had sort of tapered down to 2 launches, 2 lunar landing missions a year, and they did that in 1971 and 1972. But of course, by that time, they had already, I think they had already decided essentially to end the program. But they're again, the view at the time wasn't that there were no benefits. It's just that the cost outweighed the benefits. And so you still have those calculations being made, if they're just being made quietly in people's heads about, do the costs, do the benefits outweigh the costs, or vice versa? That's a good question from JC. I think, do you think it may be hard to rebuild the infrastructure given that SpaceX and other providers may have already ordered materials for their infrastructure projects? It's an interesting question. I guess it depends. It depends on how scarce those commodities are right now. We are seeing issues with price control due to either scarcity, either transportation issues, or fuel issues, or scarcity of commodities. So yeah, that's a good question. I don't know that I guess we're going to probably have to wait and see. I guess under the circumstances, I believe it just depends on how much money Mr. Bezos and Blue Origin can sort of bring to bear on getting that equipment. Pardon me. And it would certainly be interesting to get a sense of where the critical path is for repairing and reactivating the pad, in terms of, is it long lead materials? Is it rebuilding parts of the infrastructure, or is it installing it and getting it all integrated and retested, and what percentages contribute to that? There's probably ways of dealing with some of those, but yeah, that's a sort of a general question. Sort of, again, is it materials? Is it parts? Is it labor? Which of those contributes? Which of those contributes the most? And maybe that changes over time. So, that's it, but it is an interesting question. And that's going back to the Apollo things. It would be interesting to see the costs. I think another way to look at it would be to look at the NASA budgets from like again, you can see this from like the peak funding was back at like fiscal year 66, and then look at like fiscal year 71, for instance. But we were just going and looking back at this recently because they were talking about infrastructure to some extent and comparing what we have now with Artemis to what we had, again, in that surge. There was a surge in 1969. So if you go back and look at the period of time. So the first crewed Apollo flight, which was after the fire, was Apollo 7. That was launched off of pad 37B, I want to say, on a Saturn 1B. So that didn't use the Saturn V infrastructure per se. But then from Apollo 8 at the very end of 1968 through probably through Apollo 12. So that wasn't very long because they were able to accomplish this in that short a period of time. But they were flying every 2 months. They were using 3 integration cells in the VAB, and all 3 mobile launchers were all basically in constant use. So you launch, whichever ML launched Apollo 8 was refurbished. It would go into a high bay and be stacked for probably for Apollo 11. And so then the one for 9 would go out. And then when that finishes launching, then it would come back and go into a different high bay and be stacked for Apollo 12. And, again, because they weren't sure until they accomplished the goal, the Apollo 10 mobile launcher went out to pad B for that one launch of the Saturn V during the moon shots. And then it came back to get stacked for Apollo 13. So when they cut back and they cut down to the 2 flights per year max, they shut down everything except one integration cell, kind of like what we were seeing with SLS right now. But in that case, they had already gone up to a peak, they'd gone up to a surge capacity and had all that operational experience of putting together spacecraft and rockets in the VAB and processing them through all of the infrastructure in Launch Complex 39. And so it's sort of easier to go up to a peak and surge capacity and then come back down and just, basically use a single mobile launcher, single integration cell, single pad, and fly 2 vehicles off of that per year. So they probably saved more money than that, than $50 million, just because they deactivated a significant amount of equipment. And I imagine that the workforce came down. And so, yeah, you probably have to look at the incremental costs and the top line costs there. So, but it also means, again, that's why they could go from, 3 integration cells and 3 mobile launchers and launching every 2 months to launching twice in a calendar year. It's sort of an easier thing to throttle back than to go from twice a year, or where they are now, for instance, to go up to once a year, or to go up to twice a year. So. Yeah, some of these things, those kind of are all in the same vein of questions as what are the critical paths? I would expect, there's all sorts of infrastructure. There's there's fluids, there's propellant, which I'll set aside as a different fluid, but there's fluids like nitrogen, helium, air, water, other types of fluids like that. And then there's obviously the liquid methane and the liquid methane, liquid hydrogen, liquid oxygen that they need. And then, all of the infrastructure for that. But, the transporter erector, I did see a pretty, disturbing, picture of the base of the tower that it looks like it looks fairly precarious. It looks fairly precarious. So I believe in the accident last night, one of the lightning towers collapsed immediately. But there's we will see. But the transporter erector, I think, is I wouldn't think that by itself would be a critical path item. But as Tank Watcher's saying, it could be a cumulative effect of all of these, not little things, but it could be the accumulation of several things, dozens of things that you end up needing, and so you're basically managing parts inventory and labor in terms of getting that all done. Obviously part of this will be just cleanup at the beginning, which is what they'll start with. There will be damage assessments and cleanup, and those types of things will be going on. And that's part of that calculus about what takes the most time. I don't know that would necessarily be the most expensive thing, but there will be a cleanup, and there will be a cleanup period that they'll have to go through at the launch complex at the beginning, and that's probably a not insignificant amount of time. But it's just it may be that it's other aspects of this are going to take the longest out of all of it. Yeah, and then that is obviously another, is the root cause investigation, the corrective actions will certainly be, there will probably be more corrective actions than perhaps just the root cause, depending on how they look at this. But I mean, that's, to me, seeing, we've certainly heard rumors about that the equipment inside the HIF was damaged. But certainly nothing has been confirmed. But it at least, again, listening to some of the descriptions last night in the NSF live stream, I think there were some folks that were at Starbase when the ship blew up last June, and comparing that to this. And I think it's, you wonder, is it either too close, or is the how risky is that? And again, maybe is it, I guess, does it matter if you have that type of an accident to mitigate the equipment inside those facilities, or some of those facilities? Because I would imagine, though, that one of the lessons learned from this is probably trying to figure out if there's any way to harden the pad facilities, and whatever sort of maybe are the top 3 or top items that are the hardest to recover from, that you might spend some time to try and harden them from blast damage. So I don't know that that's necessarily the root cause to why the vehicle failed, or whatever failed. So, I mean, I would certainly be interested. I'm wondering how much of this we're going to ever find out about in public. I don't know that we are. to any great degree. Just taking a quick look. We'll have to see what happens, but um, I mean, there's probably going to be some quote unquote fog of war reports that we've heard in the early part of this, and so we'll see again if if it turns out that the equipment inside the HIF is usable, so to speak, then that's still, then that's a small positive, I would imagine, because I think the thing is it'll still be, it's unlikely that anything in there is going to take longer to replace than the pad as a whole, as an entity, so to speak. So, but it's kind of like what I think Eric Berger's story goes into this. The one that the second one that was, I think the one that was published most recently talks about, mitigating risk, having, and actually the folks, the NSF folks talked about this last night, I believe, about having, having this was a static fire test. Would it have been possible to mitigate this on a maybe single purpose stand, but on a separate test stand like they have for that's, if you look at SpaceX for Falcon, when they test these, they test new stages in Texas at McGregor, and then they go to the Cape or to Vandenberg to fly, and then they do a static fire there. But they do an acceptance test in a completely separate facility that's not really even a launch facility. It's a stage and engine testing facility. For Falcon, it's a Falcon stage testing facility, but then a more, a Merlin and Raptor engine test facility, more of a generic purpose, all-purpose engine test facility. But then again, looking at Starbase, the having that accident that they had last year was on a dedicated ship test stand, and if they had that, they had separate pads. They had this dedicated test stand for doing ground tests on the ships. Would Blue Origin consider something like that, or would that have mitigated some of the collateral damage here? So you lose the vehicle and you lose the test stand, but again, maybe the test stand is easier to rebuild than the full launch facilities. It's more expensive for sure, but again, this is there's going to be the cost associated with time lost and recovery is a big cost itself. So. But yeah, so that's, I mean, again, that's the question is, so I believe, again, because I don't believe that Blue Origin has a New Glenn first stage test stand. The stages are tested for the very first time in on the launch pad. That's the only place. And you could say the same thing about the Starship super heavy booster stage. So those have to be tested on the pad, just because in that case that's such an enormous stage. I almost feel like we've talked about this before. Maybe I talked about this on an NSF Starbase stream or something like that. But at least I understand the argument for not having something like that, because you essentially have to build something that a launch pad just to withstand the thrust of that. And then also, to be fair, I'm not sure even their launch pads, even the new launch pads, could do a full stage duty cycle, just the duty cycle for launch, forgetting about the recovery, about the return to launch site parts, but just doing the, whatever it is, 2 minutes plus of firing. I don't know that you could fire a booster stage, a super heavy booster stage on the ground for 2 minutes. But setting that aside, for New Glenn, would it be possible to do that? So you see, again, you see with other vehicles, it's possible that the New Glenn stage maybe it's possible, or maybe it's just prohibitively expensive. But then how do you mitigate the risk of having a static test of a new booster take out your, and again, maybe it's a quality issue. I don't know. Maybe it turns out that this is that you don't mitigate it by building a dedicated test stand. You mitigate it through more thorough quality measures. I don't know. It obviously will depend on what happened, what the root cause of this was, but it resulted in there's just a huge loss of capability beyond just a single tail number, so to speak. So they obviously lost the vehicle, but they also lost a significant they lost capability that's going to be much more difficult to replace than just a pair of stages. So I think, again, it's possible, certainly, since we don't know the internal discussion and the internal rationale for doing what they did. They obviously had rationale for making the choices that they made. So it's possible that even if they revisit that rationale, that they're still going to be. But then if that's the case, but that's tough. It seems it's hard. It's hard. I would want to hear the rationale for having to accept this level of downtime for a failure like this. It's hard not to look at it as a single point failure. Even if I can't necessarily put my thumb on what point that single point is, but it does seem like it's just hard to understand the risk trades there. Other than, again, maybe it's just prohibitively expensive. That's certainly there's lots of possibilities, and that's certainly one of them. Also, to be fair, it to some extent depends on the root cause, to some extent. So, because as talking about quality controls, for instance, and then if it turns out that it's something that should have been caught before this happened, then I guess it's really more about the degree to which this should have been caught before it happened. I think we'll see, but I would imagine it's hard to envision this not being a preventable accident. But we'll see how complicated. Well, we won't, but they will come to a determination about how complicated a chain of events were required for this to happen. But yeah, just it's still considering again and again fog of war. We'll see how severe the damage is. Again, somebody in chat was saying that there was a report that some of the flight hardware inside the HIF had been damaged, but then they retracted it. So maybe this is not. We don't know how bad this is going to be, but it's not good. But it might not be as bad as initial reports. And there may be components to how bad. Some of it depends on the damage assessment, and some of it depends on how quickly they can mobilize the workforce and materials and so on to recover. But it still seems like a huge a huge loss of time at the very least. And so you wonder again whether again sort of cost benefit for that too, and sort of the cost of the insurance, if they could they have bought more insurance, so to speak. And so, yeah, as Alan was asking, I don't know that Alan was asking earlier, any indication this was a GSE, a ground support equipment failure? We don't know anything about root cause at this point. So it certainly has not been publicly implicated as far. I don't think they know at this point. I don't think they've either that we've heard anything about root cause at this point, or why. I think we've heard one of the engines. It started with one of the engines, but we haven't heard anything more than that. So I mean, again, if you think about that, these are all BE4 engines. You typically, for the engines, they have the facilities. They have facilities out in West Texas, not in Van Horn, but out there. I've been out. I haven't been to their facilities, but I've been out to Van Horn in younger days when things didn't hurt as much. I used to go through Van Horn on Interstate 10. Kind of a pointless aside, yes, but they have that facility. They have a test stand, an old Saturn Marshall Space Flight Center test stand in Huntsville, Alabama. So I would assume all of the engines on the stage were tested. Had been at least ground tested once before they were installed on the stage, and then obviously fired with the stage. That doesn't, again, that doesn't mean that the issue still couldn't have been with one of the engines, but it's a different configuration than a engine test stand. So, that's. The engine may have been the thing that started the failure of the vehicle, the structural failure of the vehicle. But again, it's the whole thing about, you have to ask like 7 questions. It's like you ask a question, you get an answer, and then that leads to a second question, and you have to go 7 deep. Again, just generalizing, but you have to keep going. It's like, well, so what caused that? So the engine exploded. Well, why? What caused, why did that happen? And well, because of so and so. Well, then what was the cause of that? So, they will have to go through that. Again, I don't know. I'm not expecting because it's a private company and all of their development is private. I'm not expecting to hear that much. So, they just had an issue on the third launch. I think the statement from the Federal Aviation Administration had slightly more details than the statement from Blue Origin, and again, that's their prerogative. But based on that, and that sort of follows their typical that follows their behavior pattern. I'm not expecting to hear a whole lot of details about what happened. We will find out when they're ready to go again, and probably we will see milestones in terms of getting back on their feet, but I don't know that we're going to necessarily hear anything about directly from them about why this happened. And, we'll see. Yeah, Mooing Cat was saying, I guess, one question is how close a test stand would be to a launch pad. And at that point, does it just make more sense to make a second pad? I mean, those are all good questions. Um, I think you're trying to, do things to mitigate risk overall. So, again, we don't know what tests they did on this new first stage before they did this. This is a static fire, so this is like the wet dress rehearsals that we've been watching earlier on SLS. This is one step farther than you would do for a wet dress rehearsal. So in a wet dress rehearsal, you typically will go down to some number of seconds before engine ignition. In a static fire test, you do everything that you would do in a wet dress rehearsal, but then you count down through ignition, start the engines up, run them, perhaps let them go all the way up to main stage, to a liftoff condition, and then you shut down. Or you could, like the old shuttle flight readiness firings, you could let them come up to a liftoff condition and then let them run for, a handful of seconds and then shut them down. I think Blue Origin had done that on at least one of these vehicles, if not multiple vehicles. So, but is that necessary? Maybe if you're, they have, as an example, they do have I believe they have a second stage. They have a stand. I don't think that they're testing the second stage, that they static fire the second stage on the pad location, but I believe it's within the Launch Complex 36 area. So, it would be something like that. Now, if a second stage lets go, in that case, they are just testing the second stage, and they don't have a fully fueled first stage there. The potential energy for just the second stage letting go is smaller. But those are the types of things that you'd have to consider. But I think there's a couple of things there that you have to wonder about what their rationale was. I mean, they could already have all of it, and they're like, this doesn't change the thinking on all of that. But just testing the first stage by itself. The first stage has a lot of potential energy in it, by itself even. And, but would it, would it be better to test, and you still have to protect whatever test stand that is. So, again, if you test the stage, off to the right and it blows up, you could still have taken out and of course, the other thing is, again, the launch pad has all of the propellant loading and sort of tender loving care services that a rocket needs. And so it's a natural in terms of a place to test at least a first stage. So, but it is, I guess we'll find out whether they just decide to rebuild the pad and pick back up, or whether they decide to look into additional facilities and do something, do things a little differently. So as again, for instance, as they do with the second stage, since they can't fire the second stage on top of the first stage at the pad, they they fire it by itself, and then they stack it on, then they configure the second stage in a launch configuration with the rest of the vehicle, and then they can just do a wet dress rehearsal rather than a static fire of the first stage. But would you consider doing that again? So yeah, it's just, I was thinking of Starship, but again, to be fair, for Starship, there's just they're testing the booster stage on the pad too. Although again, they static fired the first stage on the pad by itself. But again, I don't know that if you had an issue with just the first stage, like if you had an issue last night with just the first stage and the second stage wasn't there, I think you still have a lot of damage. Maybe, a lot of it, maybe not all of it, but a lot of it. So, it's just, there's a lot of questions, and it certainly would be interesting it would be interesting to see how they go, the sort of the organizational process they go through to recover from this. It would be really interesting. Not like you want this to happen, but it would be interesting to see sort of the post-mortem for this, and what they did and how they recovered from this when they get through the whole thing. So that's probably about. So I think that we're just about to get to 2 hours, and I think it's probably going to take a little while. I don't know that I've seen anything. The one thing that I saw, I guess, sort of more directly related to Artemis was, and it's, again, it's not. I don't know that it's for sure means that the crew announcement's going to continue, but we haven't heard anything to say that they're going to reschedule it. But, as I said at the top, I did get something from public affairs that at least seems like it's an indication that they're continuing to do the preparations for the crew announcement. So it's going to be very similar to, I believe, to what happened when the Artemis 2 crew was announced to the public. There'll be what I would call a ceremony. I don't know that they're necessarily going to speak again to how they certainly they can talk about anything in their remarks, but there'll be a ceremony to name the crew. We'll see them. They'll probably have some, again, remarks during the ceremony. Then there will be a limited opportunity for media to attend the ceremony. I'm hoping to attend the ceremony, but then there will be opportunities for some media to do, I would assume, one-on-one interviews. Well, there will probably be opportunities for the big media to interview the four of them, presumably together, but there will also be limited interviews that I might have a shot. Again, I will, keep my fingers crossed, but I'm just because this is such a small channel and it's a niche channel, I'm not getting my hopes up. But anyway, they've put that solicitation out. If you want to interview the crew, fill out this form and return it. So I did that, and we got that today. I assume that I'm taking that as a sign, even if it is not, that they're planning to go ahead with that event. We'll see. Again, we'll see if there is any sort of formal response isn't the right word, but just to try and get a better feel for how NASA's thinking about things now for Artemis 3 and 4 and 5, but especially Artemis 3 and Artemis 4 because of what those missions represent. Because I still do think because of what happened last night, if they don't say anything about it before the crew event, there will be questions. Those would even be the types of questions you might hear on Good Morning America, even on shows like that. They might ask a question about that. So I think there's at least a non-zero chance that they address this in some way before the event, or maybe during it. But I just, if they address it before or after the event, that again, you give the crew their day, their moment, so to speak. They'll have several of them, but it's, to not to overshadow naming of the crew. So, we'll see. We will see what we'll see here. I mean, it's Friday. I was thinking this was going to be relatively. I didn't know that they were going to announce the crew announcement this week, and I was thinking that was going to be 24 hours ago. I was getting ready to do a video where we were going to talk. I was going to be talking about the crew announcement and the moon base and the NASA reorganization and this launch that was coming up, just because it obviously is related, but it was not. This is things have changed significantly, obviously, unfortunately. But I think there's still a lot to find out, and hopefully we will get some more information. Wonder, because it's Friday, I wonder how much information we're going to get here now. Certainly there's a lot of work at Cape Canaveral today. There was a Falcon 9 launch off, I believe it was Pad 40, earlier today. ULA is counting down an Atlas V for launch. I guess that's, again, I'm looking at NSF Space Coast Live. That's still about 3.5 hours away. But I don't know if we're going to get a whole lot more. I'm sure there will be a lot of talking, and certainly Blue Origin will be doing forensic work over the weekend. I just don't know how much more information we're going to get over the weekend, but hopefully we start to get a little bit more of an idea about the damage assessments and severity, and sort of the severity of the impact to Artemis here in the next several days. So, but let me see if there's any other. So let me go ahead and let me see if I can bring up the. No, that's the wrong one. Wrong browser. This one. I think I'm just going to see if I can pull up that announcement on the announcement of the announcement. It may be here. So yeah, you can see it says provide mission progress update. This again was on Tuesday evening, but again, so it's the live event will be at 11 a.m. Eastern on Tuesday, June 9th. So that'll be 10 a.m. Central. What is that? 1600 UTC. So it'll be similar to well, same type of thing. I was not at the Artemis 2 event. I can't remember if they did that at Ellington Field. It was not in the auditorium in Building 2 that they did the briefings and the news conferences in. in 2023. Now, having said that, there was back in September, they announced the latest astronaut group in that auditorium. So I guess we'll find out. We'll find out where that's going to be. But that's again, I'm sort of expecting more of a ceremonial event. I don't know that we're going to get to ask questions during that event. It would be a few minutes with potentially one crew member, I would imagine, for that's would be what I'd have my fingers crossed for. But again, and actually what I was asking for, because of because they mentioned this, mission progress here, I was asking, well, if you're putting, are you guys putting that on the table as a discussion topic for the media or not? And then sort of, again, I don't know that they necessarily said, I think they did say that they weren't necessarily talking about doing that they weren't planning on having interviews with NASA leadership or Artemis leadership. And again, if under the circumstances, because I'm sort of expecting to be, they'll have a list of 25 media organizations. If I just picking a number out randomly, if there's 25 media organizations that will get interviews, I'm probably about 45 on that list, or maybe 145, depending on how many it is. And so to me, it would be like, well, if I can't talk to the crew, I still have all these questions about Artemis 3, about the mission. And so I would be happy to steal 5 or 10 minutes of time from, Dr. Glaze or, the program manager, program office head. But it doesn't, that, again, I totally understand that. I think the idea, certainly the vibe and the idea is that this would be more, it's about introducing the crew and keeping the attention on the crew. And so we'll see if it's different from that, from April 2023 or not. Yeah, there'll definitely be managers there. I just don't think that we're going to be allowed to ask them questions. But we'll see. Again, now with this, I would suspect that there's certainly going to be more interest in that now, and so that's why I'm sort of half. I'm wondering if they try to address that separately from this event and from June 9th, just to, again, to keep the focus on the crew on June 9th, to try and do something. And we'll see. Again, to me, I've got plenty of time to talk to both of them, to ask questions about both of them if given the opportunity. So we'll see. It's a question that NASA would have to respond to. So silver is gold. That's one of the questions, I think, right now, just because we don't have a good sense of the status. It certainly was a big question 24 hours ago, and it still is. It's just whether it's just focused on Starship now or not. But the question being, what will happen for Artemis 3 if NASA is ready, but both HLS vendors are not? Yes, that's an open question right now. Once we have more confidence in the Starship schedules, and that they're going to have their Pathfinder vehicle ready. The offshoot of that question, though, is, or another way of asking it is, when is SpaceX going to have that Starship HLS Pathfinder vehicle, Pathfinder/prototype vehicle ready? So is it going to be mid 2027? Is it going to be late 2027? We've heard both of those. Is it going to be something else? Is it, and then ready for what? Is it going to be ready for docking, ingress, piloting? Those are all questions. And so, those we still at least have a year to find out what that's going to be. And I think I don't know if let me just take a quick peek. We're getting actually close to the sort of I wouldn't say official or ceremonial end of business. So I wouldn't be surprised if we get something that they could say something more than that. But Mr. Isaacman has already posted something last night on his social media account or accounts. I know he has an account on X for sure /Twitter. So he at least made a statement. It was a very just saying that they're aware of. And again, he may be doing. There I'm sure is a lot of fact finding going on right now, as much as or information gathering to be more generic about it. But he already made an initial statement and said they will provide updates as they know more or as they find out more. So he has certainly Mr. Isaacman has already made a statement, and we will just wait and see further statements. So, and I guess I'll go ahead and after what do you call it? Teasing, signing off. I'll go ahead and sign off. Thanks everybody for your time. This is, not how I would have preferred to be doing the next public live stream. Hopefully the next public live stream is under happier circumstances than this. And hopefully Blue Origin is able to recover from this sooner than later. But, thanks everybody for stopping by. I know there's going to be some more live streams coming up today. And so I'll go ahead and sign off. Thanks again for your time, and I'll see you next time.